Welcome, everyone. My name is Ahmed Veriava, and it's fallen on me to welcome you all to this 3-day colloquium under the title Remembering Movements. Uh, it is both a kind of privileged and also a sad moment for me, as this colloquium was initially conceptualized in discussion with the folk from SWAP, along with my partner Prashani Naidu, who, as many of you know, passed on the 23rd of December last year. And so, as we move forward into the session of remembering movements, I think it's appropriate that we also remember Prashani and recognize as well her contribution to helping us think through methodologies of remembering. And as some of you might know, the concept of remembering was an important one in Prashant's work. And in fact, our very first collaborative academic essay that we wrote together had the title Remembering Movements. And the term remembering is an important one. You'll see it's, with the kind of, so, not quite a clever pomo hyphenated concept, because for us it came out of uh, thinking through the legacy of the political movements that we came out of, remembering them, but also remembering them with an eye to transforming the way we do politics. And so the concept of remembering, I'd like to think, is one that is both a reflection on the ways in which we still live in and with the past, but also one that allows us to reconstruct our present in making something different. And for many of you will also remember that Prashant was working on issues of temporality and so forth. So the concept of remembering was very much at the core of that for her. Now, having said that, I think she'd be really disappointed if we tried to impose any fidelity in how we deploy the concept to her ideas. For Prashani, the very act of thought was one in which collaborative methodologies were part of how we not only made knowledge, but we made knowledge work for progressive and political ends. And so, what this colloquium is about, that it also followed a number of other remembering sessions about Fees Must Fall. What it is about is us thinking both about a movement that for many of us was very important, formative, and in fact helped change this university in many ways, both good and bad. But it's also an attempt for us to think collectively about what the legacy of that movement is for us today, as we still deal with the unfinished work of the decolonization of knowledge and higher education. And so, welcome everyone, and I hope that we have a productive session, and a session that also doesn't just stay within these walls, that once we've kind of collectively done some thought together, that thought can find a place not just within the university, but outside and beyond it as well. Okay, so that's enough of a preface on the remembering. I do want to kind of just say a little bit about the question that we've posed today. So myself and Tez were thinking about what this first session would look like, and we thought it would be appropriate to begin with something that was aspirational, that looked to a kind of future that we still want to make. And so the question we set ourselves for this session is, what does a public decolonized system of higher education look like? And it was very important that we didn't use the term university in that. And it's a system of higher education. How do we learn collectively together in ways in remaking our present? And so both within the university, but also beyond it. And for many of us, our formative political work and thought did not start in the university, and for many of us in the university, it doesn't end within the university. So we'd also like to think about how we broaden an idea of decolonized education beyond simply the space that we now find ourselves in. Okay. Now there are three speakers, um, and I've been instructed that one doesn't know want to go first. And but luckily, Tears, being the courageous young fellow that she is, has agreed to start us off. I have to say, I've also had the privilege of supervising Tears' PhD without throwing too much shade for way too long. Um, but Tears is someone that I've met within the university, uh, and she subsequently she studied in the politics department, and then took on a job at SWAP, and is now one of the key researchers at SWAP. And in spite of an unfinished PhD, has done tremendous amounts of work in a wide range of areas. But what I remember most about Tears is her commitment to justice and to making the world and the space of the university that we're in something that enables emancipatory outcomes. And so I think it's appropriate, in fact, given all the work that she did to get this colloquium going, it's appropriate that she start us off. So without taking up any more time, yes.
Thanks. I think it would have been appropriate for me to be sitting there, but anyways. um, when Ahmed and I discussed the question for this, I wasn't supposed to be on this panel. So I am not going to directly answer the question uh, and rather leave it as a question. Instead, I want to sort of trace ideas that emerged in 2015 that lend themselves to this question today. And I think was the moment in which the idea of a decolonized public university came to the fore, uh, most prominently publicly in the post-apartheid period. So I'm taking my cue from the rememory sessions that many of you have been at around Fees Must Fall, where we have done rememory work on a lot of these things, and I'm trying to trace from Wits these ideas of a decolonized public university. So yeah, this presentation is mostly about Fees Must Fall 2015, marking the 10-year period as we are now, and that's also, I mean, partly what this program has been about is about the 10-year, marking that 10 years of Fees Must Fall, and that's what we've been doing for the rest of the year. So I'm starting at a moment where we return from the union buildings. On the evening of the 22nd of October 2015, Wits students slowly returned from the union buildings in Pretoria. The journey was equal parts exhausting and exhilarating for many of them, setting out early in the morning to join around 15,000 at the seat of South Africa's government from across Gauteng and surrounding provinces. It was a day with running battles between police and protesters, attempts to pull down the fence and breach the precinct. Some people here were part of those attempts. Police in Nyalas circled the grounds and helicopters monitored from above. And of course, as many of us will recall, the burning of chemical toilets. Wits students were criticized for marching around the area instead of engaging directly together with other students. Part of the reason Wits students arrived back in Braamfontein so late was due to them being halted by Tshwane University of Technology students who reprimanded them for their apparent privilege and lack of engagement in other tactics of struggle to really decolonize the university. Most of these became side stories of the day. The real headline was that in an attempt to bring under control the higher education sector that had been brought to a standstill for 2 weeks, President Jacob Zuma had announced a 0% fee increment for 2016, applicable to all institutions, including Wits, where double-digit fee increases set in motion the largest post-apartheid youth protest that had been seen. The moment of return from the Union buildings was then a partial victory, but also a moment where the fractures in the movement began to be exposed more publicly. Much of this had to do with party allegiances and fragmentation along already existing political lines. I'm simply flagging this. I'm sure over the next few days we'll talk a lot more about Fees Must Fall, the movement and its fragmentation, as we have in the rememory sessions. I just want to use this to kind of highlight that this was a crucial moment where the demands of the student movement over the 2 weeks that preceded October 22nd really came into that fragmentation. Returning from the union buildings, it became apparent that the 0% increment, whilst many, including myself, argued should be seen as a partial victory, was not enough. It did not accede to the key demands that were now being made. It was a victory that felt like a defeat. The Fees Must Fall campaign started around a fee increase, but it was never about this. As students joined by workers grew in numbers, confidence, and energy, their demands became more clearly articulated along three key lines: free education, an end to outsourcing, and decolonization. In other terms that had been used in the past, the decommodification and decolonization of the university. Debates immediately following the return from Pretoria focused keenly on these three demands that the student movement was making. However, just like Fees Must Fall itself, which was not simply a spontaneous event, these three lines did not emerge during the course of Fees Must Fall, but came from successive years of struggle and organizing. Over these years, often articulated in different ways, the idea of a decolonized public, sometimes African university, was centered in conversations within the broad student and worker movement. Just a week before Fees Must Fall began on October 6, a collection of students, workers, staff, and academics across Wits and UJ mainly, joined by others at UCT and UFS, successfully organized a protest march against outsourcing. Oct 6 publicly outlined its goal as being, and I'm quoting, towards a decolonized public African university, the clearest articulation of the demands that were later centered in Fees Must Fall and the question that we're talking about tonight. But in this line, towards a decolonized public African university, was itself the result of debate and compromise, and also a result of years of collective struggle. Meetings for October 6 began in August 2015 on a broad range of issues: workers' issues and outsourcing, academic and financial exclusion, transformation issues, and conversations about curriculum decolonization, and brought together a wide array of students from different political formations and activist groupings, workers under the Worker Solidarity Committee, academics, and left leaning students who were not affiliated to existing political parties, and those that were. Most of the broad themes initially brought together were brought together initially rather through an attempt to think through what an African public university is and should be. This initial formulation changed significantly by the time the campaign was made public. The language of decolonization had become more prominent in the organizing around October 6, and calls to decolonize Wits became a key part of the mobilizations. This followed the Rhodes Must Fall campaign at UCT and related campaigns at a number of former white universities from March that year. And at Wits, similar mobilizations took place under the banner of Transform Wits. Transform Wits itself emerged from a protest in the politics department, where students put on the table both the need for curriculum reform, critiquing the curriculum's Eurocentric and Western bias, and the need for better racial representation among staff in the department. Later debates, although they were using the language of transformation, would separate more clearly ideas around transformation and decolonization, putting a critique forward of transformation as being institutionalized, as being something that was institutionalized over time. Student formations had from the 1990s relied on the language of transformation and transforming the university to put forward their own vision of what the post-apartheid university should look like. By 2015, decolonization had grown considerably in popularity and fundamentally disrupted the language of transformation. Groups of students, such as those around the Black Thought Symposium, were engaging in conversations in radical thought, decolonization, Black consciousness, the Black radical tradition, and so on. A new conversation had basically emerged in 2015. And basically, I'm saying that the kind of idea around a decolonized university really found ground here in that moment. So, given all of this that was happening in the year, the idea of an African public university was contested in the Oct 6 space. African Public University had emerged as an idea that could address debates around both privatization and commodification of the university, as well as the emerging conversations around decolonization, although not framed using that term. The question was, what did it mean to want an African university? What did it mean to want a public university? These both came from longer conversations around transformation in the university and struggles around outsourcing and the increased commodification of public education. Particularly, they were grounded in conversations around the marketization and neoliberalization of the university in the 2000s. The idea that the university was public was intended to stand against privatization that saw things like the increases, double digit increases in fees, and the outsourcing of workers who were put outside of the university, formal university community in this new model. So, public education in an African university was meant to contest the exclusionary models of the post apartheid university, and indeed calls for free education that obviously long predated Fees Must Fall spoke directly to this. As debate ensued around the need to include decolonization and in an effort to build consensus, the framing on Oct 6 ultimately changed to a decolonized public African university, bringing together all of these strands and longer histories of struggle. There was, however, broad agreement on an end to outsourcing, which was the key issue that was targeted in Oct 6 and the coordinated campaign around it. The push for decolonization then was also a push for insourcing. The campaign to end insourcing had been a long-standing one at universities like Wits. What Oct 6 highlighted was the continued effort to critique the university and reimagine it around this issue of outsourcing. Struggles against outsourcing, of course, as many people in this room know, started in the late 1990s and early 2000s as a response to the Wits 2001 plan that was seen by activists as being part of a broader neoliberal shift in policy, instituting cost cutting measures, privatization, and commodification at the university. The university pushed these through, but by 2010, a renewed struggle against outsourcing at Wits kicked off as workers came together with students and staff of the university to organize in alternative ways. In 2010, a campaign was started against a manager who was accused of racism and using racial slurs against outsourced workers. This is important to hold in mind around what reinvigorated the campaign around outsourcing. One of the students who actively organized in this period, Nadra Munshi, argued at a swap seminar many years ago that this campaign shaped how struggles against outsourcing were framed around terms of exploitation of black workers and struggles for black dignity. Under outsourcing, workers frequently described their conditions of employment as university apartheid, while students began approaching the question of outsourcing through their familial connections to workers on campus. These are important to flag in relation to how conversations about decolonization and those around a push to end outsourcing were framed. Outsourcing was about workers, but it was about fundamentally the lowest paid, most exploited black workers at this university. And the campaign in 2010 really put that at the center and then reinvigorated the campaign for an end to outsourcing. As Fees Must Fall developed, and particularly in 2016, decolonization was often the demand that was most contested as different parties, formations, and ideological positions were staked out in relation to the demand. The student movement would struggle at times to often clearly articulate what a decolonized university looked like in broad terms or in practical terms, and what the university needed to do to ensure that it was decolonized. However, the push towards a language of decolonization was grounded in critiques around racism, alienation, and belonging that formed a core part of Fees Must Fall at a number of levels. This language of decolonization has also partly been institutionalized and recuperated by the university after 2015. Part of what the movement did then was to engage in developing a new sense of ownership over the university and belonging to it, using practices that acted out what maybe a decolonized public university may look like at different points. This came from within the protest, it came in collective struggle. Students critiqued the university, showing how it operated in ways that universalized what could be considered normative, producing various forms of othering. And both Oct 6 and Fees Must Fall were moments to move beyond these approaches in organizing and in practices. The point I'm trying to draw out here is that the question of what a decolonized public university looks like is one that has consistently confronted the student movement and the broader university community in post-apartheid South Africa. Just in 2015 alone and then into 2016, there were multiple and contested attempts to reimagine the university along these lines, contesting what each term meant: decolonized, public, African, university itself, and how this needed to be rethought. The 2015-16 movement won a number of key victories. It changed the funding model, altered the NASFA system, insourced workers at Wits and other institutions, but all of these concessions were partial, and many activists from the movement continue to grapple with what its legacy is in the face of what is felt to be multiple defeats. This week, I saw a poster at Wits during protest reading "Decolonize Wits, Decolonize Palestine," which really, I think, speaks back to all of this and the topic of today. It speaks to the interconnectedness of struggle going beyond the university, linking Wits to Palestine. It's a reminder also that the work of 2015, of 2010, of 2000, of 1994, and beyond is not done. There's unfinished business, or rather, there are still attempts to reimagine and refashion the university and beyond it, of course. In the two moments that I've looked at here, October the 22nd and October the 6th, they both lend themselves to a longer reading of the demands of students and workers and staff at the university, and it becomes clearer that the idea of a public, decolonized African university has been thought and rethought in efforts to continuously reimagine the university, including, as we saw this week, in the present. Thanks.
Thank you, Tiaz. That was excellent, and I think a really good preface for not just discussion today, but for our discussion over the next 3 days. And I think this is also what is central is also the recognition that the experimentations that we discuss here have a basis in political struggles that come before us. Okay. Our next speaker is Moshibudi Motimele, or Shibu, who is a lecturer in political studies and governance department at the University of the Free State. However, many of you will remember that Shibu is in the first place a Wits student. She got poached from UJ at some point, and then came to Wits. And while she was here at Wits, she was one of the key figures who, long before the 2015 protests began, long before Rhodes Must Fall, basically mobilized the students of the politics department in constructing something that was called the Transformation Memorandum, and that demanded a reflection on the ways and content of what we teach. Uh, Shibu is also a public intellectual, and over the last decade has participated in a number of different forums and offered biting provocations around the very themes that we're discussing today. So we're very lucky to have her. And Shibu, thanks for making the drive from the Free State to be with us.
Do you want this mic?
Yeah, the handheld one, please. Thanks, Ahmed. Good evening, everyone. I think Taz and I should have exchanged notes because there's a few things she mentioned that I wanted to speak about, but I think it's helpful that I can go over the historical stuff and speak about other things. But when Taz approached me about being on this panel on what does a decolonized public university look like, rather than thinking about a substantive answer to that question, I really wanted to think about over the last 10 years how we've thought about coming to an answer to the question instead. Like Taz mentioned, in 2015, it's when the fee hike was proposed by the university that the issue of commodification of education was put on the table. And so the free quality decolonized education came around. If we think of other spaces outside of Wits, For example, at Rhodes University, in the context of RU reference list, when students sat down to think about what it is about the university culture and the university space that they had issue with, it was the rape culture and the prevalence of sexual violence against students that was put on the table. So a huge part of their struggle was a university space that is safe for women and other students against sexual violence. If we look at the space where I am currently, forefront on students' minds with issues of racism, with the rates for, students being white students urinating on black workers. Again, if we look at Stellenbosch and its cultural context, Open Stellenbosch also focused on the type of racial discrimination still suffered by students both in the res space and academic space, etc. So as you go around the universities, I know places like TUT and other colleges, alongside funding, there were administrative issues, financial support issues that then became the prime issues of those students in the struggle. So I think alongside Taz's points that there's long preceding struggles that the student movement fed into, I think there's also a lot of difference or environmentally contextual issues that came to the fore. I know at UCT, the issues around transgender students and LGBTQI students, and the type of discrimination they suffered, not only in the university, but importantly within movements, etc., then became a large part about how they described what the type of decolonized space looked like for them. So I think that's the first point I wanted to put on the table, is sort of the multifaceted and different ways in which decolonization was understood in the different spaces. Sorry, 4 hours is a long drive, guys. In the different spaces across the country, but also in that the way that the answer was arrived at was looking at what are the issues that we have. So, for example, at Wits, work exploitation was a big one with all the different cases that had come about. And so, a huge part of the narrative of a decolonized public education space became things like insourcing, right? Insourcing as an answer to the type of exploitation, free as an answer to commodification, etc. And I think that's important. I think it's important because it's been 10 years since fees must fall. And I think in institutions across the country, we've seen how those demands have been co opted, have been internalized in ways in which we still see the same types of exploitation, marginalization, and coloniality, for lack of a better word, in these institutions. And part of the issue might have been thinking differently about the imagination we want to project towards the type of university we want, not as just the opposite of the issues that we have, but maybe more creatively. I'm thinking about what is a public institution, what is the type of description we'd give to that space outside of just naming the issues that we have. And so when I was thinking about this, now I get to skip all this and just tell the story I wanted to tell. Um, in 2018, I was privileged enough to go to Sao Paulo, Brazil, with a few friends of SWAP, Leah Naidu, Kelly Gillespie, Rangwatu Sasane, and Hibist, Brian Kamanzi, etc. And we were part of a colloquium already that had expanded the notions of public education beyond institutions, that involved Brazilian students who were part of the high school protests that were happening there at the time, South African students, artists, poets, etc. And the title of the colloquium was Epistemic Risk, Knowledge, Worldliness, and the Tasks of Critical Practice. And I think the reason why I went back to this colloquium and I want to think through some of the questions that we had is because it seems to me that the most important question that we have to answer today, in light of not only the continuing situation in our institutions, but also in light of sort of the crumbling crisis of the world, right? Besides Palestine, besides Sudan, besides everywhere that you look, literally, is that there seems to be a huge gap between intellectual work and political action. And for me, if the decolonized public university is going to have any worth or weight, is to enter that critical praxis in this gap, right? So how does the work that we do in the space, whether it's within reading groups, whether it's within disciplines or just in the university space, really start to address the questions that see increases in all forms of insecurity across the world. I mean, I often think about the work that we do, and we talk about decoloniality and epistemologies and social justice, etc. And then I think about the real problems that we're facing, which is that um, people die every day for things that they shouldn't have to die for, right? Whether it's genocide, whether it's food insecurity, whether it's unemployment, whether it's the killing of each other. We really have reached the stage where our intellectual work has to go beyond curiosity and at voyeurism and reproduction and repetitiveness in ways that I think, yeah, the question of critical praxis is really the question that we have to think of. In my own work, I think around issues of pedagogy and curriculum, because the big questions of the university are overwhelming and intimidating to me, and I think that there's a lot of activists in this room and then across the country who've been affirmed and who've done really important work within the intimate space of being involved in sort of radical pedagogies by just one teacher in one class, or who've used spaces like Tribe of Moles or other reading groups or Worker Solidarity Committee to push a different type of politics that deals with the real structural issues and everyday confrontations that people go through. Um, so that's one way. The other way is to completely, well, not to dispel the sort of issues that we're thinking about, but just to think about if we had to imagine what are the central principles we'd want a decolonized public university to hold. Start from those principles and then imagine outwards of a type of practice that could support and encourage them. And I think for me, the non-debatables are one, that social justice should be at the core of everything that we do. Um, there should be a type of emancipatory ethics to not only the way that we relate to one another, the way that we teach, what we teach, etc. But that should be explicit and crude, and people shouldn't have to hide away from it. Of course, I'm not ignorant to the violent clampdown of these types of spaces. I was speaking with another colleague within sociology at Wits, Mbuso, about how the space at Wits purely to commune has closed down so extremely since Fees Must Fall, at the same time that things like decolonization keynotes are given, seminars, colloquiums, etc. Just the type of spaces for political conscientization, the things students would do on the halls, etc., has so much become not just securitized, but regulated, and you have to go through all of these, that really the institutionalization of decolonization has actually worked against all the type of structural elements that you need for any type of radical praxis, right? One, which is just to be able to be together, to think together, to be able to express those thoughts, etc. But we know this isn't a Wits problem. It's a global problem as universities are attacked and shut down around the world. But back to the question of imagination, when we were in Brazil as part of this epistemic risk colloquium, we had a session with Silvia Federici, and her husband gave us each a book, which I only read 8 years later. But I picked up the other day, and it's called Wages for Students, and it really was uh, great for me because it really helped me to get out of this conundrum of how do we think beyond what we've been told are the important elements of decolonization, which have just seemed to reproduce itself in many sorts of ways. And the provocation of the book is simple. George argues that students should be paid because in essence, universities have been created as these factories for human capital, right, which is true, and also to create types of technologies and research which are just used for further securitization, bureaucratization, and clamping down of social space. And so one way for students to reclaim power is not to be made to pay for an education, which then is used to the benefit of others, but to be paid to be educated, right? And I thought, well, this is great. These are not the types of conversations we're having. Perhaps the demand at the union building shouldn't have been for free education, but for paid for education. Um, and I think the basis of the provocation is important. I think The book says that they take inspiration from the movement in the States around wages for welfare, right? So that people should be paid in social welfare, housing, etc., because of the labor that they give the state that is not valued or remunerated in certain ways. And I think that's how we start to change the conversation. So free education, when it was on the table, everyone said, well, who's going to pay for it, right? Because affordability was just assumed to be something that you couldn't escape. But I think if you change the terms of the conversation, so for example, pay this little factory of human capital that you're going to abuse and exploit for the rest of their lives, right? It forces a different type of conversation between institutions, etc. I think in South Africa, the question of a public institution doesn't even exist, because if you look at, and I do this in my PhD, all of the stuff coming from university managements during fees must fall, before fees must fall, and after, is that this is how South Africa is going to free itself of all of its social ills. You're going to come to university, you're going to be educated in something important, hopefully STEM. You're going to go out, contribute to the economy. When you build the economy, there'll be more for all of us to share. You're going to be a contributing citizen, blah, 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 right? They've all accepted that. The universities that have the most funding now are the ones doing stuff around AI. UJ has been eating AI billions for years, right? Are machines replacing humans, whatever it is. Um, and and I think that that's extremely dangerous. So Ahmed said, okay, we're thinking about public education and not universities. So maybe that expands the hope, right? That we're not limited to the confines of um, the institutional attachment to national and international political agendas, which I think we've seen even recently with with other issues. Um, let's see what else I wanted to say. So, yes, I think some of the things we can deal with, the issues that have been put on the table are important. Representation, yes, you need to get more diverse staff complement, etc. The curriculum absolutely needs to be expanded beyond what is currently not just Western focused, right, or neoliberal focused, but really just strategies of power that legitimize things like apartheid, which we're seeing again all over. Which legitimize the extremely high levels of inequality, poverty, sexual violence, etc., that we see. Um, so for me, a decolonized public university puts the question of the relationship between knowledge, critique, and action back on the table. It makes social justice the thing that um, determines everything that we do. Another paper I'm currently writing is thinking about uh, prefigurative politics, okay, outside of the movement, because I've thought about it there, but even in terms of institutional relationality, we all say, or people who support decolonization are still in this type of hierarchical, bureaucratized admin structure of the university, right? And so nobody wants to be the dean or the DVC because there's certain whatever it is. Um, but the same people want to make decisions that could then have an impact, and there's no impact without power, right? There's no power without resistance. Ahmed's PhD is coming to mind. So all these things, all these things are related. I think the last thing I want to say is that the question of a decolonized public higher education space is both a social and political question. And unfortunately, people don't want to speak politics as if their intellectual projects are not rooted in them. So that's another thing we have to get over. Um, and if you don't think it's political, there is a politics that you are contributing to, and it's probably the one that's the problem. Um, so these are things we have to be open about. Um, the demand for a decolonized public education is a political claim that has both communal, national, international repercussions. And yeah, conservatives, fascists, genocide people are definitely instrumentalizing these spaces for their purposes. So we should be unashamed in doing the same to act against them.
Thank you, Shivu. As always, you've given us so much that I know is going to be taken up uh, when we get to the discussion section. Just so people know, I should have said this at the beginning. Um, all of these sessions that are going to follow over the next week should be treated as provocations. They are kind of initial thoughts for us to begin thinking together. So rather than a kind of set of experts who tell us what a public decolonized system of higher education is going to look like, that work falls to us as part of a prefigurative decolonized praxis. Uh, okay, so so far, the last two speakers have largely focused on what has come out of Fees Must Fall and the debates that came out of this specific milieu that we call Wits University. Our third speaker, and very intentionally included in the program, is not from South Africa, probably has not uh, attended the Fees Must Fall protest. But nonetheless, her work sits uh, uh, um, deep within the questions that we wrestling with today. So our next speaker is Mariana Mora, who's an associate professor, researcher at the Center for Research and Advanced Studies in Social Anthropology in Mexico City. She holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of Texas at Austin and an MA in Latin American Studies from Stanford University in the US. Her research focuses on struggles against violence and the continued process of colonization as part of state formation in Latin America, and her scholarship is situated within critical race theories, gender studies, decoloniality, and the political. She is author of the award-winning uh, Legal Politics, which I'm sure I butchered, Indigenous Autonomy, Race and Decolonial um, Research in Zapatista communities, as well as numerous publications on the everyday struggles of autonomy and reterritorialization in Zapatista communities in Chiapas. And so hopefully the transition to an online speaker is going to happen seamlessly.
Good afternoon to all of you. Are you able to listen to me well? Can you see me and listen? Yes? Are you able to listen to me speaking? I'm seeing blank faces, so I think that no. Yes? I'll just keep speaking until you let me know that you are able to listen.
It seems like it's only us online who can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. But I'm looking at Ahmed's face and I'm understanding that
Mariana,
they're not listening.
It should start. We're just sorting out the tech.
Okay, but just let me know when I should start. No, I'm not muted.
I think you're online now. They just
Can you hear
sorting
me
out
now?
this. Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm in a cafe, so I'm just hoping you're not hearing the background noise and you can hear me well. Can you let me know, Ahmed, if you're listening well to me?
We can hear you very well. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Well, I thank you very, very much for the invitation. It is really an honor and a pleasure to be here with all of you. I want to thank everyone who has organized to make this event possible, and Tasneem for the email exchanges and for sending me such thought-provoking articles on the recent struggle in South Africa. So I continue to learn and elaborate a talk that bridges geographies with the types of critical interrogations that, as Moshibudi just said before me, are so urgent and critical now. So first, I want to say that for decades, the struggle in South Africa, beginning obviously with the anti-apartheid struggles, has been a source of inspiration on this side of the globe. It's certainly been for my own political formation throughout the decades, and I'm talking about political formations way beyond the university setting. And I want to recall that that 1994, which is a critical moment that I will be speaking from, was a year that bridged our respective geographies of struggle. Both the formal end to apartheid occurred at the same time as the uprising of the primarily Mayan rebel army, the Zapatista National Liberation Front, in the southeastern state of Chiapas here in Mexico. From both locus of enunciation, there's calls to end racial capitalism with its segregations and with its, in our case, anti-indigenous and their anti-Black racism state formation, and the negation of subjugated knowledges and self-determination. Both struggles have had then to confront and face the effects of neoliberal policies with its waves of privatization, watered down multicultural reforms, and the particular production of subjectivities. Obviously, 30 years later, neither South Africa nor Mexico are the same countries, and the racial forms of structural inequality cemented in colonial structures of rule continue to permeate both of our spaces of being. What calls us together in these times, and specifically today, is to critically engage with radical genealogies of struggle of decades past, not as a nostalgic move, but as a doubling of time, a folding and refolding that nourishes genealogies, social memory, and the embodied affirmations that other worlds are not only in fact possible, but are consistently being rehearsed in our everyday struggles and forms of engaging in politics. And so as I was listening to you, Ahmed, I was thinking of that actually, I wrote this before I listened to you speak about how remembering was so central to Prashani's work. And I want to emphasize and hold that here today. And so these processes of remembering of political actions, sometimes they condense in historical moments of influx, like was 1994 or with the fees must fall in 2015. Sometimes they operate below the radar in low decibel politics, but they are always constant currents, streams of water perpetually searching to return, hydrate, and provide life to their pathways. As I was thinking, I was listening, and I was just recognizing the current moment that we're living at a world scale. I was drawn to think about the work of Robin Kelley, the African American historian from the United States, and the questions that he posed several decades back in Freedom Dreams, the Black Radical Imagination, you know? And how he questioned in a moment, it was after the World Trade Center towers falling, that he questioned how the inertia with which we tend to think of social movements. And that there's an inertia that tends to think of social movements evaluate them through a measuring stick, that if social movements reach their objective or if their demands were met. And if that's the measuring stick that we use to measure social movements, then most would fail, no? But what would happen, Robin Kelley asks, if we were to listen to hear in ways that the measuring stick shifts, not if the success of a social movement is measured upon its demands, but on the way it inspires, feeds into, sustains, and sows the grounds for future mobilizations to take place. If it's about our history, and I refer to in our diversity, diverse locuses of enunciation from the global South, committed to anti-colonial, which is obviously anti-capitalist, anti-racist, and anti-patriarchal. It's about weaving the terrain onto which the possibilities of other forms of collective life existence emerge. Then if that's how the measuring stick, then social struggles succeed to the extent that we continually revisit the past so as to continue walking. And so the image, just I wanted to leave an image that I have is sort of the active embroidering, no? It's for a design to emerge. Sometimes you have to stitch a few back the thread, and then you have to go back, and then you go to the side. And it's that stitching back and forth of an embroidery that allows an image and allows the materiality of the embroidery to emerge. And I think that's how we have to think about perhaps of that kind of remembering that Prashani talked about. So it's a great honor, as I said, to be here with all of you and to speak from the state of Chiapas, to speak. I'm in Mexico City, but I'll be speaking about the Zapatista movement. And I want to state that if my commitment to understanding and learning from South African struggles has been consistent, it took a new turn when my friend and colleague, Dr. Elena Chavez from the National University in Mexico City, put me in contact with Prashani last year. So last year we had a series of dialogues over WhatsApp on Chiapas and the Zapatista struggle. I put Prashani in contact with dear friends of mine. I lived for many years in Chiapas. She was able to travel there and meet with several of them. And as Ahmed said, that exchange that I was hoping would take place for many years was tragically cut short with her unexpected passing last year. But the fact that I'm here with all of you today is a way I hope to continue those conversations, not only in Prashani's legacy, but with the expanded web of colleagues with whom she was intellectually engaging with and creating critical knowledge with. And for that reason, what I asked Tasneem to send me some articles so I could dialogue, and I will do that right now in a PowerPoint presentation, because I know that sometimes watching someone in sort of this Wizard of Oz image on the screen can be a little bit exhausting. So I read some of Ahmed and Prashani's work, Moshibudi amongst others, and I want to be sharing. I'll be sharing the screen and going back and forth with thinking of the radical imaginaries from Chiapas and what does it generate, probably, or hope for spark the conversations that all of you are having in the university today. Are you able to see on the screen?
We are.
Oops.
We are.
Okay, hold on. I will do this back. Okay. So I'm not keeping track of time, so just let me know. But I wanted to, from the conversations that I had with Prashani, from the different articles that I read, that Tasneem was able to send to me, I prepared this series of slides on decolonial knowledge production and radical political imaginaries. So reflecting on South Africa through Zapatismo in Chiapas. Now I'm trying to move there. So I wanted to begin with this remembering, and actually I switched the Yabasta with the shutdown fees must fall on purpose to situate that where we are is in these sort of transnational, transgeographic conversations, that there's two elements that put us together, both a politics of the refusal, no? So I put the Yabasta, the call of the EZLN in 1994, the enough, next to the roads must fall. And I put the image of the shutdown, fees must fall, next to the toppling of the statue, Diego de Mazariegos, which was a Spanish conqueror. There was a statue that was in the center of San Cristobal, which is the colonial town of the state of Chiapas in southern eastern Mexico in 1992. And so I think what brings us here today is both this politics of refusal, no, that's obviously very clearly placed in both of these images that dialogue with each other, but at the same time, this call to remembering. So I wanted to put this quote from Prashani and with Ahmed, where they both state that rememory becomes the means through which the silences and omissions of the dominant order are animated for the living present, the process through which subjugated knowledge has become reinserted into history. It is finally a way of reinscribing affect, emotion, and subjectivity as central to the ways in which meaning is constituted in the world. So how do we remember in this constant back and forth in time through radical political struggle? How does that generate our own temporal rhythm terrain that goes beyond capital time? So remembering becomes a way of slicing across time of capital. And not only in this act of remembering, but I also wanted to think about, I have this image of the way that it's not only the time, the past, the present, and the future, but it's always these sideways. Again, thinking, also, as I said before, about thinking about embroidering and stitching, that sometimes threading forward, then threading back, then threading to the side. So I think we're in critical moments in world history where genocidal times are squeezing our possibilities of existence. And so then when there's a squeezing that happens, we need to figure out how to sidestep. And sidestepping becomes also a way of talking across geographies of struggle, talking across geographies. And so here I have an image where Chiapas is dialoguing with South Africa, where there's a key term that the Zapatistas use of queremos un mundo donde quepan muchos mundos, which is a world where many worlds fit. And I was thinking of the words of Palestinian scholar Edward Said, and how Edward Said in Traveling Theories talks about how people in schools of criticism ideas, how theories also travel from person to person, from situation to situation, from one period to another. Cultural and intellectual life are usually nourished and often sustained by the circulation of ideas. So we hold that possibility of a collective life existence and other worlds possible through that circulation of ideas, while at the same time we have to specify what kinds of movements are possible. So what I have prepared for all of you today are three elements that I thought after reading the articles that Tasneem sent to me. I thought of three elements that I would suggest perhaps, no, and it's an open question, maybe travel as part of the circulation of radical political imaginaries in these current moments to South Africa from Zapatismo. One is the decolonizing times of the political, and I'll go through all of these now. The second is pedagogy along with mandar obedeciendo, or governing by obeying. So how is collective radical knowledge production forming part of a collective sense of being an authority, of governing by obeying, not obeying by governing, or governing through the inversion. And then the third has to do with reterritorialization from autonomy to a current debate right now in Zapatismo, 30 years after the uprising, referring to El Común, which is the commons. So I want to go through those now, just to recall very briefly. I want to, we tend to know a lot of Zapatismo, the uprising, from that very first image of the uprising, where there's Celtal, Tzotzil, Tlajolabal, and Chol indigenous Mayan soldiers taking the streets of San Cristobal. But what I will be speaking to all of you today has to do with what's the other three images, which is more Zapatismo on the ground, the everyday politics of building autonomy, claiming self-determination, generating processes of reterritorialization, and doing so at the margins of the state. So the way that the Zapatista territory is divided in Chiapas is through autonomous government bodies that have their own agricultural, education, health, administrative bodies. And all of this is done in rejection of state institutions, state government funding, state programs, including anti-poverty programs, including no public education teachers, because there's a critique that public education, as it stands currently today in Mexico, foments the anti-indigenous and anti-Black racism. So there's a whole educational process that I think builds these public education institutions that the three of you were speaking about today, but at the margins of the state. So it's another way, I think, of thinking institutions. So the territory has been divided since 1996. They took over land that was plantation lands of white cattle ranchers, and have since then created these other spaces and other ways of resolving conflicts, of thinking through health initiatives, understanding health, education, and making political decisions. Within that space, I want to focus briefly on this first element, the decolonizing times of the political. So how, and I think here the main critique is, I think the radical element is how you establish notions of the political beyond formal politics, beyond the liberal sphere, beyond sort of this masculinist public-private divide, with its clockwork. Capital time not only regulates us as workers, but also regulates the way we engage in politics. So this is one element I wanted to bring forth. And I was thinking of it, as I was reading Moshibudi's, one of your articles, where you state that by espousing a genre of humanity illegible to racial capitalism, the Student Worker Alliance forced the university out of time in a way that endangered its ability to meet the expectations and responsibilities of the capitalist clock. So I thought of this as, for me, it's a central element of Zapatismo, that rather than reading what's the strategic conjunctural moment, what are the right conditions to engage and intervene into the public sphere and to engage in political action, there's a shifting of that time, of that temporality, of that rhythm, and engaging in the political, which is different than politics. Engaging in the political on their own time frame and creating other conditions that are not reducible to the strategic conjunctural conditions that one would need to intervene to shift the movement of history. And so I think it's going to be hard. I was going to put two videos, but I think I'll just describe. One has to do with the March of Silence in December 2012. It wasn't any specific moment. There's no conjunctural moment for the Zapatistas to have a march, but they took over the town of San Cristobal, as I had done in other moments. And so if you start to think of, if you have 20,000 Zapatistas, all unarmed, but taking over a colonial town and all traveling to condense into the central plaza, one would imagine that the Zapatistas would then, they would converge. There would be a particular moment where one of the leaders would get up on stage and would speak, right? And would tell everyone why they were there congregating, what was the relevance. But instead, everyone marched in silence, and there was a platform in the center of the plaza, but the whole march consisted of walking up, raising a fist, and walking back down. Everyone. Thousands and thousands and thousands of Zapatistas over the course of a couple of hours marched up, raised their fist, marched down. No one spoke. There was no culminating act. There was no convergence. There was no figure of authority to speak. So the tempo was created by the embodied sense of transforming the public space into something that spoke through a silence. There is a silent signifier that everyone was embodying. So that's one example that I wanted to provide as a way of shifting, both moving from politics to the political, and from creating a moment of influx and a political statement of political action that is not inscribed to the times of politics, nor to conjunctural moments. The second has to do with the 30th anniversary of the Easy Island Uprising that was in January 1st of 2024. So here you see the Easy Island political military members of the army, of the rebel army. And so again, if it's 3 decades later, you would think that there would be sort of this masculinist military bravado show of force. And what that video shows, and I can send it later if you want to see, that they put on music, a cumbia, and all of the military of the Easy Land danced in the public space where we were all spectators. So it was a way of saying the revolution is literally done by dancing, no? And it was also a way of saying the social transformation happens in other ways, and you may expect this of us, but we're going to do something else. So I wanted to think about this after Moshibudi's article that I read of how you decolonize the times of the political, the tempo, the beat, and think of the political as opposed to just politics. The second has to do with pedagogy and mandar obedeciendo. And it moves, it's certainly does not override, it exists in tension with, but I think it's fundamental against the legacy of left masculinist vanguard politics. So here I was reading Gamedzi in an article that I also read. And in the article, there's a citation of Toni Morrison's work and how one gets a real sense from her stories that despite the horror, the violence, and the trauma of racism, Black people have and have always had stories outside white terrorism. She makes a political decision in her writing to center Black people rather than white supremacy, opening up different creative and political potentialities. I think what we are interested in thinking about in relation to shutdown is the possibilities that open up when the campus is claimed and the spaces under new management have not yet been purposed. When you occupy a house successfully, what do you do with the house? What kind of potentialities emerge? So with these types of questions in mind, I wanted to put forth as a sort of a reflective provocation, what I consider to be pedagogy as part of the art of governing. So here there's an image in a Zapatista community of an assembly. And I think one of the elements that I really take away from the past 3 decades of building autonomy on the ground is the difference between being an authority and having authority, right? One could be an authority and claim that authority and be on the stage and tell people what to think about, or having authority could be a way of conducing, of facilitating, of generating collective knowledge production to draw from memories, draw from these acts of remembering, but understanding that there is no one head in that assembly that has the answer, and there's no predetermined answer. It's rather generated within the space of the assembly. So that process of generating means that the act of a collective authority of governing collectively, there's a fundamental pedagogy. You need to be able to facilitate the generation of collective ideas to come up with solutions that then turn into a praxis, rather than the key leadership showing the pathway. So I'd like to think of in this reflection with all of you today, how one thinks of public education or public radical knowledge production as central to the way one thinks of a figure of authority as an individual, as a collective, and how one, I think if there's one moment in history where the concepts that we have been taught and we learned to name the historical conditions that we're living are not the concepts that are going to get us out of genocidal times. No? So that means we need to think about pedagogy as part of this governing by obeying. So that's a second element I'm throwing here as a provocation. I'm sorry I'm going overboard in time. I only have one more slide and then a brief summary. The third has to do with thinking of reterritorialization. As I was reading about the fall, the FISMA's fall movement, I was reading how there's certain things that it's not just about public education, it's also about getting the land back, no? And there's a whole call against privatization. And so here I was reading one of Prashani and Ahmed's articles, and I was seeing these connections between processes of reterritorialization, these claims of autonomy, the return to the commons, that are forms of against the notion of property as foundational to racial capitalism and to conquest. I was seeing that as a third bridge to South African struggles that are outside of the university, but definitely inform how to think of decolonizing public education. So I had here a quote of how the introduction of the prepaid water and electricity meters in certain areas in Soweto and Orange Farm, how activists began to destroy those meters and to actively prevent their installation in acts of disobedience. And a quote from one of the interviews that Pushani and Ahmed had of water is life. If they privatize water, what do we do? Our lives are being privatized. In South Africa, there are no longer citizens. We are all customers now. That's why we are fighting privatization. In Zapatista territory now, it's not only the white plantation farmers, it's not only the mega development projects, it's also organized crime and narco trafficking that's generating land dispossession. So you would think that in a moment where there's so many actors that are trying to remove people from their lands and privatizing not only territory and land, but also life and life existence itself, that one would want to claim communal property as a collective defense. But in that moment, there's been a call from Zapatismo on the questioning of the call to El Común, which is sort of a refashioning of the idea of the commons, that is against the notion itself of property. So it's understanding that property is the first stepping stone towards racial capitalism. And so how you think of reterritorialization beyond even the collective or communal notion of property, but the idea of the no property, because property itself is conquest and it is colonialism. So this is a third element, I think, that is radical. How you think of collective knowledge production that is in the commons, that it's not about even collective ownership of property, of knowledge as property. How do you think beyond the notion of property itself? So to end my talk here and open it up, I wanted to highlight 3 points. Just to close, in what ways do these concepts travel from Mexico, from the specific geography of Mayan territory, and from outside the public higher education into systems of higher learning so as to contribute to radical forms of decolonizing public education in South Africa? And so the 3 takeaways I want to leave with all of you here is the way that subjugated knowledge production can emerge from and contribute to decolonial radical imaginaries that connect formal educational spaces to broader communities. How to think of anti-racism and anti-colonialism as founded on a critique of property and on the refashioning of the commons. And how to invert the clockwork of capital and prioritize the tempos and the rhythms of daily life, of collective care work, and of embodied learning as central to that radical imagination. An apology, I went a little overboard, but I wanted to contextualize everything. And I thank all of you very much also for the opportunity to be with all of you virtually from Mexico City.
Thank you so much for that, Mariana. And I think what I really appreciated, although it was completely spontaneous, was the ways in which the 3 different presentations built on each other, and I think took us to a place where we're in a kind of good position to have a conversation about how we attempt to build rather than even saying a public system of higher education, a common system of higher education that reflects our politics of decolonization and anti-capitalism, which I've just thrown in there. But I think it's appropriate now. Just to get us started, like I said, this space for you to engage the different speakers, to ask questions. But what we'd also like to see is people's inputs, people kind of filling in the gaps, or rather that helps us think about how to fill in that gap between knowledge production in the university and political action, as Shubhu has provoked us to do. But also, coming out of Mariana's talk, I remember I went to the World Social Forum once, and Arundhati Roy gave one of the keynotes, and she had this beautiful, the World Social Forum had one of its slogans was "Another world is possible," and her provocation was, "Another world is not only possible, but on a quiet day you can already hear breathing." And I'd like to also hear about what are those ways of breathing that in this kind of suffocating context that we find ourselves, that are already pushing us towards a different kind of politics, a different kind of system of knowledge production that does put social justice at its center and does enable emancipatory ends. So with that, I'm looking around for any hands that are ready to go up and want to make a kind of contribution to the session. There will still be more space in the coming days. But yeah, or just questions for any of the speakers.
Enkosi, igama lami ndingubuntu Makedama and I'm a student of African literature. So I have been sitting with thoughts about the concepts that we use to envision this new world. So the decolonial theory pushes us to imagine a decapitalized, depatriarchalized society. And then with the input about anti-blackness movements, of course, there's also the blackness as a conceptual framework, which also pushes us to think about a world that is blackness, that is unimaginable, that hasn't been, experienced. And I struggle now to reconcile how different conceptual thinking, because in keeping in line with Fees Must Fall, that's where the hindrance also came about, because there was this far left ideologies which also spoke about free education. And then there was the center as well, which questioned that if I can afford, why the other person, why must I not pay if I can afford? Then there were the far right people as well who said, you know what, we have achieved our struggle, which was a zero increment. So you see the conversation is happening between ideologies now. So I'm thinking about the decolonial theory as well, which doesn't center blackness in it. It's almost as if, it's superficial. It's bringing everyone in. It doesn't consider the black lived experience. And I think if we are, and I'm also provoking this, I'm pushing back the provocation that if you are to imagine this new world, and perhaps by extension also includes higher education, then we have to start with the black lived experience. So the black lived experience also translates to the black feminist experience that is also African, which, I think differs marginally through other aspects of feminism as well. So that's the provocation that I'm currently pushing out there, and the thought that I'm sitting with right now. Enkosi.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Molweni. Good evening, everyone. Molweni as well. My name is Sonobile Pongela. I'm also from African literature. I'm touched by some of the comments that Ubuntu makes. I'll start by saying, in 1867, Walter Bagehot wrote that there are two elements in the Constitution: the efficient and the dignified. But he was referring to the monarchical constitution of Britain, that the crown and the government coexist with trust, with understanding, and also with the fact that they have to lead the nation. But now I'm perturbed by one thing, that Fees Must Fall, for instance, came at a time whereby we were made to believe that there was a relationship between the dignified. The dignified would be us as the people, and the efficient would be the government. So that, to me, the fact that in 2025, we're still talking about a pushback to the government, that to me reads to a nation that has been fed all kinds of lies. all kinds of lies, all kinds of disappointments. And I speak to the notion that the voices, the struggles of blackness in a higher institution, the financial, problems that led to such movements is not answered and is not accounted for by government. How then do we make those that we have elected to be efficient to serve us? How then do we make them accountable? So I think that's one of the conversations that I'm very much, interested in. And I'm struggling with the fact that they are not accountable. Some of them go to their deathbeds without being accountable. And this is actually a problem. We can go around in circles trying to create all kinds of ideologies, linking and interweaving ideologies. But the minute that we forget who we are and we don't make these people accountable for, then that's where the crux of my concern is. I mean, Ahmed, we can't be over 50 still talking about social and student movements without any answers. No, I'm not saying you are. I'm just making an example. So the thing is, it speaks to the fact that the Constitution in itself is a very compromising document when it comes to the promises that were made prior to 1994. So I think we need to speak to that, into questioning as to why did 2015 happen? Why did 2016 happen if those that are claiming to have been the custodians of the so-called democracy had carried on to actually make sure that none of the people that did not experience majority of the harshness of apartheid, if that was the claim, why are we still here talking about it? Accountability. Thank you.
I mean, I'd like to also think that accountability also extends a little bit beyond the Constitution and the kind of sellout. It's also about a radical imagination that was never included in that Constitution.
Dumelang. I'm hearing people say I'm from here. I guess then I'm from Norway. I'm troubled. And my troubles and troubling center violence because of the way violence lives and births and continues to hold ransom our bodies, my body in particular, because coming back today into this institution, there are two conversations that are happening that I know of right now. It is this colloquium and it is the Drama for Life conference happening down that side. And some of these conversations, while the lines are parallel, they don't always speak to each other. And oftentimes I find what happens in the academy, we are saying the same thing in different ways, sometimes speaking at each other. But the embodied, the lived is a memory and a reality of violence that sits with the marginalized, with the excluded, with those whom violence continues to be enacted upon them and continues to dwell and live among them. And how that memory of that violence is often evoked anew every time one needs to step into these spaces. So when we are imagining or speaking about a decolonized public higher education, I don't know what it looks like. But I know the dreams that we have been fed, the hopes that we fight for, and what she has said, at the heart of every action, social justice should be the core. And I wanna echo, even though I was late, what you said about, or what I heard as you saying something related to pedagogy and classrooms, and how sometimes, and this is my understanding and my summing up of what I heard, that the radical or the revolution might be with that one teacher or person who's in the room facilitating that process. I might find myself rambling because I'm trying also to feel through what I'm thinking through, and to challenge those in the room that are at the helm of teaching. Because oftentimes these things that we teach and speak about affect people directly. And those who have privilege to write can then go write about it. Because sometimes even with the project of coming into the academy to learn, to produce knowledge, to contribute to that knowledge is at times a project that remains unfinished, because the reality of the violence of the space that is or continues to live in the memory of coloniality and the reality of whiteness and capitalism is that even finishing a qualification becomes a privilege. So when we are thinking about these spaces and practices, how do we then also rebel against the norm and sometimes the rules? Because when it becomes hard to exist in this space that we find ourselves in, and the space that we are imagining to want to change into a decolonial and public space, but you find that even as you were saying, access is so controlled. Moving and breathing has also begun being policed. That how you move inside Wits has to also involve your DNA, how your hand passes through what, how you get through where, and what you get when you can no longer afford to pay your part to be able to participate. The exclusions and inclusions at a whim. And perhaps the challenge then becomes, or has to go back to the human. The act of resistance then have to go back to us individually. How do I assist another continue, even outside of the mainstream? How do I continue as a lecturer, a student, a fellow human, to help another continue whatever vision, whatever dream that was, even if it does not get to be realized in the mainstream or in the form or in the ultimate end, a qualification or whatever publication. So I guess in my rambling, and this is a thought that is beginning and is not even formulated yet, to say, can we perhaps first challenge our own humanity before we want to theorize? Because I, as an individual, I'm exhausted of hearing people think, hearing people talk, seeing people try and look smart. Granted, you are all smart, you wouldn't be in the room. But what about the ethic of care? What about your humanity? Where are you when care really matters? When your presence is really needed for these pedagogical and the revolutionary and the knowledge production to continue? We can't always then continue to say these spaces, Wits and whatnot, we are what make these spaces. Where are we in the fold? What about the logs in our own eyes? How do we then begin to correct that? Thank you.
Okay. Just two quick provocations. And these come from my own locationality. I got a doctorate degree 33 years ago and decided not to enter into the academy, but to enter into mass politics and movements. And I've spent the last 33 years in those movements, from the liberation struggle underground to the Communist Party, to the anti-privatization forum, to the Right to Know campaign, to the anti-xenophobia movement, and have been an insurgent in terms of an intellectual. So there's two provocations. One is to take up this notion of deterritorialization, because it seems to me, I remember 30 years ago that this campus was completely open. The Wits was a very open space. You could come onto here. It's now a prison. No working class person can come onto this campus hardly at all. So it's in some ways, the intellectual production is a prison that takes place, and everything takes place in here, and only the privileged can come into this space. And most academics don't go out of it. They don't. When we just held a mass meeting of trying to prevent people from other African countries to stop asking for their dompas in clinics, where mothers and children are dying because they're Zimbabwean, because we have a nationality. And now to get to the second provocation, and not a single academic was at that meeting. And there were 300 people there in a movement that is right in our city right now, right around the corner, where people are being denied. And we want to talk about Africanism. We want to talk about Ubuntu and other things. And yet it's happening right here, but there's a complete silence, mostly, of what's going on just down the road. So to me, that's the provocation, is how do you open up, and Mariana's thing about, how do you get that space opened up again? How do you get people, the barriers taken down? Because there are physical barriers, there are financial barriers, there are practical barriers, taking those down to where the production of knowledge can then generate and germinate across barriers, because right now it's not happening. That's the first thing. And that goes to the second provocation, which is, can you even talk about decolonization without talking about denationalization? Because nationalization is at the heart, and I mean nationalism as in the national state. The national state was at the heart of the colonial project, the creation of a national state and boundaries. And yet we begin, what do we see around us? We see the weaponizing of nationalism to exclude other Africans, not other Europeans, not other Asian, but Africans mostly. And yet there is what in some ways that's just a provocation about denationalization. Can we even begin to talk? Because to me, much of the decolonization vocabulary is nationalistic. It's framed by the nation. It's framed by appeals to the state. It's framed by appeals to everything. And therefore it undermines its own self. Those are the two provocations.
Thanks for that. I want to just check with Shibu and Tasneem if you'd like to come in and make an input now, based on some of the comments that we've already gotten. And then, yeah, and then I'll take another round.
Yeah, I don't think there's been any questions, but just to maybe say that everything that people have said is important and valid, but so for example, the first comment you were saying we should center the Black lived experience. I think the question of today is, what would a public education look like that centers the Black experience, right? Those are the answers we're trying to have, because I suppose the purpose of what I was trying to say is that speaking back to what we don't like puts us in this type of reproductive bind. So if you were to answer your own question, right, it's not, the Black experience is not centered. What would a public education that centers that look like? What would your answer be? And I think that's more important, right, to provoke our conversation. I don't know, I always feel like the D word is imposed on me. I'll speak about ideas and then people will call that decolonization. So I think we also don't have to be caught up in those debates about what decoloniality or decolonization has meant, has done, has not done. Again, I think we need to start from a different starting point, right? that's not helpful. And if those discourses aren't helpful, if that politics is not helpful, let's just suspend it and start something else. And I'm really interested in the politics of the intimate, and Tabile knows this. That is the space of the most violence that we experience. But then going back to the sacredness of the classroom, also the most liberatory experiences that we have as well, right? So if we start thinking about that, we come to these things, we can speak about what is radical, what is critique, what is decolonization, and then you walk out the room and get sexually violated by someone, or you get excluded from something, or whatever it is. And so I think real radical politics starts in our intimate relations with one another. It starts in the type of imaginations that we center. So we know all the things we don't like, we know what we don't want, but let's start creating the language of what we do want to see. What is it? The things that we want to see centered, the things that are important. And I think that's the type of critical praxis or radical praxis that's going to help us move in the right direction. So the state, institutions, etc., that's not my stuff. I'm not interested in the macro. It's important and people do it, but I'm interested in the politics of the intimate.
Mariana, if you'd like to come in as well, you're welcome to. Just let me know.
Oh, not right now. I'll let you know.
Okay, thank you. At Dale's provocation, and Shibu's follow on from that, if these words like decolonization and so on are not serving us, maybe we should move on from them. I do want to say something, though, about this term decolonization, at least from my own appropriation of it. I do think, there is a way in which the struggle for national liberation came to be very tightly bound to an idea of decolonization. And it was largely, in the context of anti-colonial struggles and a demand for self-determination and autonomy, based on the kind of geographical constructions of the colonial era. But I think what is important and what came out of Fees Must Fall was an idea that saw decolonization as a mode of almost permanent critique, a permanent critique of who we are, the ways we've been shaped by colonial frames in ways that we didn't really recognize at the time, precisely because we were shaped by them. And I think our kind of relationship to the nation state is one of those things. Our attachment to the political community we call a nation is something that must itself be constantly critiqued. Now, maybe we call that something else other than decolonization and so on. But I'd like us to hold on to the fact that the best traditions of decolonization didn't simply see it as a mode of critiquing an existing colonial power structure, but also recognize the ways in which our own subjectivities have been shaped by these colonial contexts. And that as we kind of push forward a politics of decolonization, which also means us leaving behind some of what we call decolonization, precisely because we recognize that we're something other and we're becoming something other. And I do think here the Zapatista slogan, the one no, many yeses, the one world in which many worlds fits in. I mean, they're very nice, beautiful, neat phrases. But I think what I get from them is also a recognition of our own multiplicity and also making sense of that multiplicity in trying to forge a politics that takes us to a frame in which, Mariana, you said beautiful analogy of the river, that's going to kind of, and I'd like us to think about what that politics could be as well. How do we kind of germinate multiple fields from our own activity? And of course, again, just to come back to Dale's provocation, there is a way in which this university, you know, when I got here, there was no fence around this university. And one of the initial demands of what was then called transformation was the idea that the university had to serve as a resource for the rest of the city. Now, I'm one of those academics that wasn't at this meeting to discuss, you know what I mean, the very real struggles that are going on in our city. But I also think that part of a mode of higher education that is not institutionally bound depends also on how we are able to engage, not simply as the resource people who come there with the answers. You know what I mean? How are we able to engage with the struggles in our own city? And I think that that's essential. Sorry, it was a bit much for me, but yeah. Okay, you go first, and then you can make it.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Tepo. I'm a student. I just want to, also contribute something here. Maybe by way of a little bit of history. If we go back 10 years, it's 2015, fees must fall. If we go back another 11 years, this is 2004, where I was a first year student here at Wits, and we engaged in something, very similar to fees must fall, which was we were protesting against financial exclusion. There was a lot of violence, lots of violence. We shut down the university. So it's a long-standing struggle, And then if we go back, to 94, when we say we started, we actually democracy was born, so-called democracy, which I don't see as democracy anyway. If you go back further, you land in the 80s when there was lots of violence leading up to Mandela's release. You go back to the 70s, now we're talking Soweto uprising. So what I'm looking at is a pattern of violence followed going in decades, 10 years, 10 years, 10 years. And then when I look at what is achieved after each of those events is not much, if you ask me. And even we are here now and not much has been achieved. And then I'm asking myself, are we not doing what Einstein called insanity? And we are doing the same thing over and over again, and we are not achieving anything really. So I want to pose a question or a suggestion or a what if the strategy was changed, instead of thinking violence to get something, to get what you want, to get what you wish for, because it's clearly not working. And I'm not saying that maybe are we due now? We are in 10 years now after fees must fall. Are we due for another act of violence, protest, whatever, for the same thing that we've been fighting for years and years, right? So now I'm thinking, isn't there another way to go about this? And what I suggest, or what I have been thinking about, is why not reject instead of react, right? So if you don't like what is being done, if you don't like what is being offered, why not stay away? Why not say, okay, I won't participate in this? Why not reject this whole colonial system the way it is, the way it is structured, right? I don't think education is not something you should pay for. I don't think we should be paying for education. I think education should be free from the time you are born until you get whatever highest qualification that you can get. I don't think we should be paying so much. Otherwise, it's a privilege because that's the way it is now. It's a privilege. Only a few can access higher education. And we have lots of capable young people in the townships. I come from a township called Soshanguve. Can tell you that there's lots of capable people that cannot access universities. So the ones that make it to university, the ones that come to study something and be significant in this world that we live in, then tend to look down on the ones that could not access this, right? So what if the ones that are in these institutions that have this privilege actually stood with the ones that cannot come to these institutions and reject this system altogether? So I'm proposing, instead of engaging on another act of violence to try and get what we want, why not reject, stay away? Passive aggression, I don't know what I can call it, but maybe it's about time we look at a different way that we can go about this fighting of this decolonialization and all that. Thank you.
All right. So yeah, I just wanted to thank you for your presentation. I just felt that toppling statues, like in the examples of Fees Must Fall and the Zapatista in Mexico 30 years ago, it poses a danger of allowing ourselves to become obsessed with this concept of decolonialization and its interference with the academic objectives of higher education. Does decolonization become the focal point of academic knowledge production at the institution that is being re-territorialized intellectually? Is there a platform for academic knowledge production in a vernacular context? Do we have courses in vernacular languages like Zulu, Xhosa, Afrikaans? If we are saying we are decolonializing the academic teaching system, is there enough decolonized literature, pedagogy, and research that is sufficient enough to completely replace the current academic curriculum without diluting the quality of education that the university is offering its students, without compromising the standards of knowledge production that students are deserving recipients of? So those are some of the things that we need to think about and not allow ourselves to be obsessed with that issue of decolonialization to the point of compromising the very values and standards of academic knowledge production that the university stands for.
Thank you so much. I thought that was as the discussion kind of proceeds tomorrow. So just a couple of housekeeping kind of announcements before I kind of close for the night. The session tomorrow begins at 11, but breakfast will be available for people from 10 a.m. So please come. And, you know, part of the work of these kind of sessions is also the work that happens outside of this room. So please engage with other people, say that speaker was full of shit, so on. Okay, so that was the first thing. Secondly, I wanted to just thank again Mariana, Mora, for taking time to join us online. Thanks also to Tasneem, Essop, and Shibu for their inputs. thanks especially to the entire SWAP staff who made this happen, and under very uncertain circumstances, because we weren't sure where the money was coming from and so on, but we knew we needed to do this. And yeah, and thank you all for coming. The turnout has been very inspiring, and I hope to see you guys all here tomorrow. Thank you.